Okay, welcome everybody to another Future Teacher Reborn session. For those that are not familiar with Future Teacher, we've been running these since 2017, or if not just before that. And you'll find in our resource, which is the same link that you visited to register for the session, all of the previous sessions and the recordings and resources that we've shared with those sessions. On the Reborn page, you'll find a bit of a summary at the top, our principles about us, next phase, and details about sharing and social media. Then the current topic today, rich media, will be at the top, and then previous recordings and sessions will be lower down the page. So the one we run on in October was developing learners' digital skills, and there's the speaker panel there and the recording from that one. And the speaker panel today, we've got Linda's presentation and Dustin's presentation will be added after the event. And I think about 1:30, you'll see the registration form for, if you refresh the page, you'll see the registration form for the next session. So just a reminder for anyone that's new here that it's a very rich resource. Put the link in the text chat. You'll find all the recordings and resources that we've done previously. But today we're talking about rich media. I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to one of my colleagues.
Okay, I'm Sharon Williams. I'm one of the Future Teacher helpers. I'm going to introduce Dr. Linda York from Bangor University, where I'm also based. Linda's a specialist in geomorphology, which is the study of landforms and processes that shape them, past and present. And Linda's going to talk about she's very involved in issues around inclusion and accessibility in fieldwork, including the Cultivate project through digital technologies and virtual approaches. And she's going to look today at the current and future directions of travel within geosciences. That she's going to discuss those during the presentation that's about to start. Thank you, Linda.
Oh, diolch, Sian.
Diolch.
Okay, I'll make sure I can share my screen. Let's see, hopefully that will work. Let's go presenter mode. Yeah. Excellent. So thank you very much for the kind invite. And as Sean's already mentioned, yeah, I've kind of been involved in sort of inclusion and accessibility through a number of research grants that sort of came out at the time of the pandemic. And really sort of what I want to try and talk through is kind of, I suppose, my journey through to the sort of digital and how I've really been engaging with it and sort of just walk you through kind of the stuff I've been doing and maybe where we're at, but also just thinking a little bit about maybe what we can do, what we need to do. And as Sean said, you know, thinking about really sort of, I suppose, where we could get to ultimately sort of in geosciences. Like I say, a lot of my job is spent, you know, in the field and doing field teaching. And actually, when pandemic happened, and this really was transformational in terms of really sort of how I thought about my teaching and my accessibility, although I was very sort of inclusive about what we do, it really got me to think, actually, what can we do really from the desktop? Because I wasn't going out into the field during that time. And it really sort of started this kind of digital journey. So I'm going to start with where I started because, you know, I think that's easiest. And you know, there are so many sort of easy ways of bringing sort of in the digital and kind of facilitating that kind of easy engagement for students. So, you know, something as simple as PowerPoint, I know everyone sort of takes that for granted. This is a PowerPoint presentation, you know, but I think at the start of pandemic, actually nobody had really thought about the ability to kind of use PowerPoint for maybe more than just a lecture sort of delivery, and actually using it to create sort of guided exercises. So, I mean, the example on the screen is just me when I had long hair and I was kind of recording sort of snapshots, you know, pieces to camera effectively within my kind of sort of pre-recorded, sort of almost like a vodcast, I like to call them. But it was just a way of trying to engage the students with the material. It wasn't just simply looking at the slides. It was trying to be a little bit more dynamic and in that sort of sense. And then the other thing that I really got into was the OneNote, which I'm sure most people here are sort of aware of. And I still use OneNote quite a lot. So there's an example on the bottom of my screen there where you can actually embed a lot of different media. So although it's not a sort of, you know, it probably doesn't come across that large on your screens, but, you know, I've got an embedded sort of little sort of short video lecture. I've got some imagery where I'm prompting students to sort of engage with it, almost like a little pop quiz. I'm walking through some examples, and then right at the end, I've got a kind of opportunity for the students to reflect on that learning process, and the QR code actually links to a Padlet. So, you know, sometimes it doesn't have to be really complicated ways of getting, you know, students to engage. And I should say, and something that came out very strongly during sort of pandemic is actually, you know, this isn't always easy. If you've got sort of digital inequity and you're asking students, as we were at the time, to engage, you know, through live streaming or be able to have access to, you know, the internet, it can prove problematic. And obviously rich media is kind of, you know, bandwidth heavy. But on the flip side, if you can create something that enables the students to play around with it in their own time, to kind of engage with it in a way that isn't kind of rushed and forced, and they can go back and revisit it, then actually something that's quite simple can be quite effective. And that's literally where I started, in these kind of very kind of simple, what can I do? What tools effectively did Microsoft have that would allow me to kind of bring, well, particularly for me, bring the field and the field learning into an environment when we physically can go out into the field. And then I kind of progressed quite quickly after this point. And I got into sort of apps and tools. And again, I use apps and tools in a way that is helping students to engage when we're actually in the field, because again, you know, students have different accessibility needs. Not everybody is able to sit and make notes coherently. You know, there's often issues with, you know, people being able to hear in the field, or, you know, if you've got dyslexia and I'm dyslexic, you know, you can really find it difficult to sort of make those notes, distill what your lecturer is talking about. So I've really been into kind of trying to experiment with apps and a way of kind of creating sort of digital field notebooks. And obviously some of these, you know, they will work offline, so you don't need to have, you know, a 4G signal to kind of do it. And on the top part of my screen is the GeoExplore, which obviously I'm from a geosciences background. You probably get just reading the sort of menu there that it's obviously connected to rock types and sedimentology. And the other app is a Clino app, but actually it also has a digital field book embedded into it. It allows students to collect information in one place, collect photographs, you know, really try and engage with the site, that we could then take that information back to the classroom, as it were, and actually work with it. But something else that I still use a little bit, and again, it's about another alternative, I suppose. It came from Microsoft, obviously the Sway sort of technology, and I do use that as kind of easy readers. Again, it's very much like the other applications. You can embed rich text, you know, rich media, photographs, videos. You can put links to other websites. I find that really sort of a way of, again, it's about giving options to students. I think the Padlet's also something that I use more in a classroom-based setting, actually. But the fact that you can upload images, you can prompt students to talk in an environment where they don't actually have to notify themselves. You know, you can do it anonymously. You can get that kind of greater engagement. And some of the things that I've been trying to do is build confidence before we go out in the field. So actually that opportunity to kind of have a session where students might want to anonymously raise issues, or, you know, they don't feel comfortable asking you something, you know, in front of the whole class, but it's quite an important point. I've kind of been using the Padlet in that kind of more dynamic, interactive way. And then the sort of last image on the bottom of the screen, it's not something I've done personally, but I have a colleague who uses the Sketchfab, which, you know, you can basically do it from your iPhone. You can create 3D images and allow, again, that kind of interaction. It works on a VR headset as well, so you can actually work with it. This obviously is an example of a rock. You know, it's small scale, but again, it's trying to do something with quite simple technology. You know, most people have a phone. You can, you know, sort of get an app that you can scan the sort of 3D image. You don't need a big scanner. So yeah, there's a lot of different things. But really, I suppose where I've moved on to and in the kind of things that I've been doing to kind of be more dynamic is annotated imagery. So ThingLink, it did used to be free. It's not as easy to access these days. It will give you a free account for so long. But again, this is just an example from a valley in Norway that I've been working in. You can add in imagery, you can add in text, you can prompt the students to think about it. The next thing I've kind of done is the virtual field trip. So I love story maps. Again, you can see the examples down the side. I've created quite a lot. I use them both pre-field trip, during field trip, and then post field trip. And again, it allows you to build in a lot of information with the students. I will talk about something we need to think about just carefully when we get to the end of this. I've also been experimenting with field site videos. This might play in a moment, but I will move on because you don't need to hear me speaking. But, you know, that idea that we could create little snippets and sort of host it on a YouTube channel where the students could actually watch it before they went into the field, or students that weren't able to go in the field, again, would be able to watch it. So, you know, it does involve a lot of work. And again, I'll talk about this before we finish, but it is something that you could just do with a phone. I'll explain. I sort of had a slightly higher level of expertise and input to create this, but it is quite an easy win, really. Oh, I'll just move on. And then something I've been doing more and more, and I think it's probably reflective of where we're at just in terms of student engagement with sort of, you know, virtual reality is this idea of the immersive technology. Going out, creating, sort of collecting 360 imagery of a field site. I've done it for Cwmyd. Well, it's very close to the university. It's like 15 minutes up the road. And then this is an example of one of our students who's actually exploring that Cwmydwell trip through the headset. And again, I've got some comments that kind of might bring it home to you as to why it kind of works. And then the most recent and probably most exciting thing I've been working on, and I can't claim credit because it was my colleague Andy Smith here at Bangor and JISC, Peter Kent at JISC that have kind of come out and trialed this. But effectively, it's the ability to live broadcast and collect data sort of simultaneously, both being sort of in the field and having somebody actually based in the lecture room back at site. So the first image you can see that looks like a mast, that's part of the 5G network. It broadcasts across the site. The coverage is phenomenal. We trialed, you know, live lecture streaming. We used Twitch and Teams, and that's what the sort of middle imagery are. We also had the drone out, and that's what the far imagery is. We were live streaming drone flights over our field site straight to the Twitch site where students could actually watch and engage it. Some of them were quite brave and put the headsets on, the sort of virtual reality headsets, and were kind of engaging with it that way. And that was very much about a trial. But the idea is that means that we could work, if we have this 5G network, and it is really just at the inception, you can go out into the field. Students who aren't able to go out in the field could still participate if they were based in the lecture space. We could live edit digital field books. We took out the tablets. So we had real-time data collection. We had that digital kind of opportunity to kind of do it. And again, I've got some comments from the students about how they found that process. So I kind of just want to sort of bring everything together because obviously, you know, I could talk for ages about all of the things we do, but I think where are we actually at in terms of where we've been going? Well, I think there is a lot of things we could do, and some of it can be too much, but actually you could think about merging a number of approaches. That's what I've done with the story maps. I use Story Map as my gateway tool, and I merge like the drone footage, the annotated images, things like that within it. you can't underestimate the time that it takes to do it. And sometimes there is a lack of recognition. I think that's less so now than when maybe we first started. Again, with that sort of third point, you know, sometimes you don't always have the in-house support. I think there is some fantastic support, and again, that is getting better. Something that is quite interesting, and maybe an assumption, there's actually a lack of maybe digital confidence with staff, but also an assumption that students can just pick up and run with it. And sometimes they can, but sometimes actually it can be too much. And of course, there is a sort of a cost associated with developing all these kind of tools and having these bits of equipment. So, you know, where are we at? I actually used an internship, and obviously I was very fortunate that I had NERC funding to do some of the inclusive and accessibility work. I made sure that when I was doing the filming in the field, I actually had a media student come out with me. They were my director. You know, I had to do scripts and everything. It was really helpful. I do try and work on a sort of a lean sort of model, a budget, you know, that's quite small. What can we do? You'd be amazed at what you can do on, you know, the turn of a penny. And I think, you know, thinking about that idea of learning on demand, you know, you create these resources, but actually you can always go back and revisit them. You can update them. I think as long as you have that element of learn by doing, so that students aren't just passively kind of looking at the imagery, you've actually got some prompts, it can become very participatory, and it can give an experience that is comparable to actually sort of being in the field. Just this kind of brings it round, really, that idea. This was just an example from one of my story maps. I have a virtual trip for Norway, is that idea that, you know, you do need to scaffold that activity. It can't just be, here's some nice images, because that is very passive. It's got to be dynamic, it's got to be engaging, it's got to be a way that gets the students to think about things in the way you would expect them to be able to do in the field. And then I thought this was quite nice, and I wanted to sort of signpost. So the first two are comments from the students that came out and helped us trial this 5G. So you can see the first comment is, you know, it's related. It was extremely impressive to, you know, virtually engage with Cwmidwell, you know, it gave them a real sense of the route. And I think that's really important, because you want it to be reflective of what you're trying to ensure that students who can't participate for various reasons actually have that same comparable experience. And then, you know, we were using the sort of digital notebooks, and this is the idea that you can partner up. So if a student can't physically be present in the field, you've got other students in the field, you can actually have dialogue that's going on at the same time. You can collect the data, you can tidy the data. I quite like the fact the student, you know, this idea of, you know, we didn't need to double handle the data, and it was always editable in real time. And, you know, it does mean you don't have to transcribe it from your little notebooks when you get back. But there obviously are some issues. It can be overwhelming. It can be daunting. You know, this isn't a one model fits all. Different things will work for different students. It does obviously address some of the EDI issues, but also there are issues associated with engaging with this digital technology. It doesn't solve everything. So you could go on to, you know, new pedagogic journeys. It's not about supplementing, not about replacing, it's supplementing sort of what you do, and it can be that self-guided autonomous learning that students actually quite like. So just to say, these are a couple of things that I've put together. There's a chapter coming out later next year. There's a how-to guide based on the sort of more inclusive fieldwork that really talks you through how to create some of these virtual resources. And then just to say thank you to a couple of people who've helped along this journey. And I hope that was spot on time.
Perfect timing, thank you.
That's fabulous. And I think we'll move on to Dustin before we bring all the questions and interesting points in the chat together. So Teresa.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I'll just, it's lovely to see Dustin again. I haven't seen him physically in real life for a long, long time. And it gave me an opportunity actually this week to take a look at what he's been up to online, and to see how he describes himself online. He describes himself as an educator and perpetual student, which is right up my street. We live and learn, and we have to keep on learning and living. He's lived and worked in the USA. He's taught in China, Russia, the UAE, England, Kazakhstan, and more recently Scotland. As I say, we met face to face many years ago. We were both linguists with an active interest in the digital, and we've interacted online before and since. His language expertise really shines through when he contributes to online forum spaces, and I see him all over the place, including the new European Digital Hub just recently. I believe his teaching philosophy, which he's made very explicit on his website, so all the W's, Dustin Hosseini, all one word, .com, in his portfolio. I recommend everybody read that. I think it's a fabulous document. It really brightened my day when I read it. Dustin, I'm passing over to you, and I'm very grateful to you for accepting our invitation and coming to speak to us today.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Okay, so I'll go ahead and quickly start. I'll be talking about, can you see my screen? Okay, just in case.
Yep.
All good.
Okay, good, just to make sure. I'll be talking about just a brief experimentation I did with Google Notebook LM to create a podcast from a source. And although Teresa's kind of introduced me, she's probably introduced me better than this, but yes, I'm a migrant, I'm neurodiverse, I worked in EAP and then learning development and academic development. And parallel to all of this, just like Teresa, I was always interested in kind of digital education. So working in the TEL space, blended learning. So over the years, I've been kind of a EAP tutor, a learning technologist, which has too many different meanings, a learning designer, and I currently supervise master's students. So my expertise is kind of an intersection of academic, digital, pedagogic research literacies, and more recently, decolonizing education and generative AI literacies. And I study a doctorate part-time where I'm looking at decolonial practices of HE practitioners. So just some basics. Google Notebook LM, you do need a Google account to obviously experiment with it. This quote is straight from my blog. It is an AI tool that that's kind of geared towards note-taking and research based on select resources that a user uploads to a notebook, or well, a digital notebook. So basically users can upload PDFs, other types of, I think mainly Word documents for now. And what I'm focusing on in this talk is how it can be used to turn those sources into a podcast where two avatar interlocutors discuss the content of the source. So Notebook LM can be used for other things like actually interrogating a resource, a document, but I won't be talking about that. So reflections on practice. When it was launched, I guess, just not that long ago, less than 2 months ago, I uploaded a paper that I wrote, and then I created a podcast from that. I uploaded a paper I wrote because I didn't want anyone criticizing me for uploading anyone else's research. So I uploaded a doctoral assignment that I wrote and passed. It was my work, so I knew exactly what it was talking about. I also wanted to understand the tool, how it could be used by educators in higher education and other areas of education. So from that, I then created a podcast, and I listened to the podcast to see what it was going to say and what it would kind of sound like. And if I have a chance, I might share a snippet today, but I might not. I then reflected on what it created, and I provide some critiques. And you can actually read the blog. Teresa, if you can share the blog post as well, it's the most recent one, to the chat. That'll give people a way to kind of quickly read about what I'm talking about. So some good points. The podcast gave a decent overview of the paper that I uploaded. The overarching summary was pretty good, and the ideas were conveyed pretty well. It provided a really good, I thought, introduction to the gist of a complex topic. It broke down what was an academic paper and put it in more of a conversational means. So if you have a particularly complex topic that you might want to teach students or that students are learning about, this might be one way to kind of introduce them to that topic. If you want example topics, Foucault, the topic of decolonization, anything that you can imagine that might be problem posing kind of to new learners and even staff. So the issues were that I found from the kind of experimentation was that in the paper I uploaded, the sources that I used were from 2020 to 2024, right? So it was a particular range of sources. And just for context, the paper I uploaded was a systematic narrative review. So it was looking at about 18 different papers. And I synthesized what those papers were saying using a thematic analysis. So the avatar speakers claimed, from what I remember, that all of these sources were actually from, the research was from 2024. Now, maybe they meant the research as in the paper I'd uploaded was from 2024, which is true. But if they were talking about how all of the research was from 2024, that's false. A lot of the research on decolonial practices in HE, they've kind of grown over the last 5 years or so. And of course, discussions around decolonization have been ongoing, depending on what area you're looking at, for 20, 30, 50 or more years. It depends on what aspect of decolonization you're talking about. Another big issue, which I found, was that no specific references were drawn upon or mentioned by these avatar speakers. That's problematic for a few reasons. If you want to know in an academic way who said what, when they said it, and to understand the context, this particular podcast won't give you an understanding of that, which is quite a shame, because if you have a complex topic like decolonization, you're going to have a lot of voices who have contributed to the academic discussion around that. Or if you think about the third space professions or academic literacies, we know, probably a few of us know John Lee and Lee and Street. Within this type of podcast, their names would be probably absent. So it's good for a conversational summary of a topic, which is great. The other issue, perhaps, which is something I had to reflect on later, was there was a bit of sonic whiteness that colored how the avatar interlocutors spoke and sound. So what that means is, really, they sound like speakers, and there's no way to change this. They sound like typical North American speakers, actually, or using the kind of dialect of what's called General American English. You'll have to look that up to understand what General American English is, but it's pretty standard, like BBC English, or what you might hear on CNN, Fox, or the major American networks. The other thing which I found a little bit annoying was that, and this was more of an annoyance, there was way too many fillers. And what I mean by that was there was a lot of fillers like ums, ahs, and yeah, affirmations. They were getting a little bit annoying. So you'll have to listen to that in the podcast if you have a chance later. You can find that podcast clip on the blog that was shared earlier in the chat. Now, some possible applications. Again, learners or you could create a podcast about a complex area of interest, to break it down, to help people understand the particular topic from a kind of introductory level. Students could help themselves by reviewing and revising coursework. So say that they wanted to listen to something in the gym or out on a walk, they could upload their notes and then listen to it in that manner. It probably would depend on the topic. I don't know how it would work for mathematics, for example, but it's worth trying. Also, learning for understanding what you're learning, interrogating what you're understanding. This might also be another way that educators and students could use NotebookLM to kind of understand what they're learning, by checking their knowledge, by effectively listening to it again, and then thinking, okay, I understand, and I know who said this, and so on and so forth. So this could be perhaps a helper for creating activities that align to kind of Bloom's taxonomy, as an example. It can help them perhaps remember, to understand what's being said, perhaps to apply, but the upper levels, the more critical levels of Bloom's taxonomy, they may not be there unless they're directly engaging with the content and critiquing it. Whether the podcast was doing that, I'll be honest, I didn't listen that deeply. Maybe they did. This is where you have homework and you can go check. So, questions?
That's great. Thank you very much, Dustin. I think we're going to, I'll just check with Lillian, we're going to open the floor for Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to grab the mic and speak to us.
And I was very remiss when Linda finished. I forgot to ask her to pop into the chat her questions to the audience. I'm gonna pop in one of them if I can find out where I I copied and pasted them. So Linda's asking the audience, and it'll be Q from Linda. I'm just typing in the chat. This is Q1. So you could reply with just reply in the chat to Linda's question. And Dustin created a question for the audience to engage with, which I'm going to put in the chat as Q2. So please do. Oh, where's my screen gone? Okay. So please do feel free to kind of engage with replies to those questions as well. And I just thought we could experiment by being quiet for 1 minute. This is going to be really hard, being quiet on air for 1 minute. But let's try it as a way of being inclusive. We're going to be quiet for 1 minute while we consider our answers to those questions from the presenters and reply to them in the chat. Set a timer. Okay, that was 1 minute which went by. I'll just quite quickly. I'm sure people are finishing off their questions, etc., in the chat, which is great. I hope this just 1 minute help people for questions to bubble up for people as well. So feel free to finish off your replies in the chat. I'm just going to direct some questions from earlier to Linda first. And I think, Linda, people really liked your point about the power of PowerPoint and how we maybe use it a bit passively. And Alistair commented his professor's love for OneNote as well as an easy way to create web resources. But Shan was asking whether you knew about Xerte at Bangor for creating that kind of ThingLink-like experience, Linda.
I do know about it because Shan has mentioned it to me, but at the moment I'm still embedded with ThingLink, but it is on my list to have a go because yeah, ThingLink does have, yeah, my original account went missing, and at the moment we've got another colleague had some money from a grant that we've extended it, but yeah, there is so much good stuff out there, and some of it is literally just finding the time to, you know, sit down and play with it. And I mean, that's really my whole approach to this was, particularly when we were in pandemic, was actually going to webinars or watching, like, you know, 10-minute explainers as to how to do things. And I think part of that gave me a good idea of actually what worked and didn't work if I was going to do it, as well as learning how to do the process, if that makes sense. So I think I saw a comment about, like, you know, actually academics are kind of on this learning journey as well. And that's definitely what I would say I was on. You know, it wasn't something that, you know, I thought about the inclusivity, you know, when we were doing field work and how we do it in practicality when we're in the field, but actually this was a different way of thinking about it that's kind of prompted a lot of change.
And I think that's I always like to promote something like Xerte within the university, because there's potential for students in your subject area to have a go at making these resources for each other. So it's much more extendable maybe than a license that the lecturers hold. So it can shift, it can be more inclusive from that sense of the word as well, can't it? I
Oh,
was wondering about, sorry.
no, I was just going to agree with you.
Shan was wondering about how many VR resources there are out there as OER, and I just searched on Google. OER Commons is like, oh my God, another discoverable world. But certainly, if anyone else is aware of these, then please do add your links into the chat. Teresa's just used a big word that I don't understand. Also, anyway, didact.
Autodidact, yes.
Didact.
People who are willing to teach themselves.
I learned a new word today, so worth it. And then Victoria mentioned about this additional challenge that if students need technical support out there while they're doing field work, and you've introduced technology into the thing, it can become an extra layer of support that you need to provide, especially if it's a larger cohort. And I don't know if you've had that encounter and how you did any troubleshooting.
Yeah, no, I did sort of pop a comment. I think where there are, PhD researchers available to do demonstrating, that is invaluable, but it's much harder to get demonstrators these days because everybody's, you've got your research to focus on and you've got so little time. Actually, it does often fall to the academic member of staff, but I would never just go straight out in the field and do something. I always build in like a pre-session. So yeah, it quite often does fall to the member of staff. And I mean, some of my colleagues on the biological side of our school that I'm based in have huge classes. And they were trying to do virtual labs, and you're ending up running them multiple times because obviously you need that small class teaching to be able to be engaging. Otherwise you're student, but that is an extra thing. I mean, that's sort of what I was sort of getting at towards the end is, there is a lot of additional work associated with this, and sometimes it is very much driven by passionate staff that have really got into it and want to do it, but it does come with its own particular set of challenges. I think as we move forward and it's more widely embraced, I think that things will change, and there'll be more opportunity to sort of do innovative things, and things will become easier. Students will, I mean, a lot of like doing the VR stuff the other week, the students were flying with it actually. But I think that's because, with the gaming and stuff, not everybody's into that. I mean, I thought I'd feel sick when I put the headset on. I kind of avoided it, and actually it was fine. And I can see why a lot of people might be put off as well. So yeah, there are challenges, but I think it's trying to give options to students. Liz, my colleague, who I know you said had done a talk, she uses that word optionality, and I'm not sure if it's coined by her. I feel like it is, but I do think it's about giving those options to students. So like I say, it's not about everybody doing the same thing. It's about providing different ways to make that inclusive and accessible experience.
Such a valid point, that optionality. Yeah, whenever some colleagues go, yeah, but what about, well, it's like you say, making sure you've got that entire spectrum of needs accounted for, and not throwing out and not saying you're only using one thing. And I love what you said about needing to scaffold the activity, because you forget, I think sometimes people forget, especially like with flipped learning. It was like, well, I've created this pre-resource, they are supposed to be able to run with it, but remembering to scaffold, absolutely. Some great things happening in the chat, which makes me think that 1 minute was so worth it. Dustin, we've got some interesting comments from your session while you were talking. People were very amused by, oh, here we go, Gen AI is making up facts again. All the speakers are from drawing from 2024 research, for instance. And that's because it's an LLM, isn't it? It's not a sense-making machine as such. It's just a predictive text machine at the end of the day. Any comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said is exactly what it is. We have to, I guess, be patient with these things because they won't always create the exact thing we want them to create. They're all under development. Um, but unfortunately, they're here to stay. So we have to kind of get to know how they work, to try and challenge how they work, to make them better if they are going to stay and they are going to be used eventually. There was a good question from Mike about, is there any evidence that listening to chatty podcasts is a good way of learning? I have an anecdote. On my doctorate, there was a course on education policy, and some of us were really struggling with the topic because it was so dry and boring, really. Even the most capable called like peer who eventually left to go do another doctorate, she was asking for this because we wanted to kind of listen to the complexity around this topic as we were doing other things. We did have a book, we had, journal articles that we could have read, but we found that they were so dry and they weren't giving enough examples of how things were really working that we couldn't get our heads around it. Also because we weren't policymakers, we don't work in policy, we're educators. So for us, it was a new topic to kind of get into. And ultimately, I actually did find a series of podcasts by someone who I think used to be at, or is at Sterling. I don't remember the guy's name, but he has a good website with blogs. It's called, oh yeah, actually he's still there. It's called Understanding Public Policy in 1,000 to 500 Words. And that really helped. So I would say from personal experience and from those of others, it does help. As far as research, there's plenty of growing research, I think, that I put in the chat from different areas, medicine, midwifery, other topics, where people are seeing the kind of benefits of doing this. And of course, it's always better if students can co-create the podcasts. The issue with that is a lot of, especially new educators, don't know how to get these kind of requests for assessment for kind of creative assessment past their boards. The boards tell them, oh, you can't do that, or it's a group assessment, so it won't work by default. But actually, because it's so creative, I've seen from practice at Lancaster and elsewhere, actually it does work. Having students co-create in a small group together a podcast, they can really get into it, especially if it's given a nice chunk of a mark, but also you're assessing things like not just creativity, but also dialogue. And this comes from a colleague friend now at King's College London. You need to assess dialogue as well. So not just, is there an introduction? Is there a conclusion? But are they engaging in dialogue with one another during their podcast? And you can create a rubric to do that. It's not necessarily easy, but it's certainly doable. But other than that, going back to kind of Mike's question, even for the doctorate, sometimes I'll try and find podcasts on a particular topic so that I can so I can listen to it while I'm doing other things, basically. Out to walk, in the gym, wherever, so that I can deepen my knowledge around that particular topic. Conducting a systematic review is not a fun thing. So trying to get my head around understanding it was essential to kind of my knowledge, and it helped. But as I think some other people have said, it depends on your mode of learning. Some people love paper, sticky notes. I hate them because they will become a giant pile. I will lose them. Or even if I go through a book, which I have done, and put lots of stickies, I will rewrite all those up, or sorry, type those up so that I can easily search for them. So it comes back to a kind of learning preference and mode. Not everyone will enjoy listening to a podcast, and that's okay because they might learn in a different way. And yes, pragmatics matter.
Thank you, Justin. And I so agree with you that it's and it ties into what Linda was saying about options, right? It's providing people with options and modes for learning. And if you think that translating it into a different kind of mode helps you to learn, great. So it's about where and when do we teach students about experimenting with what works for them. And this webinar is about rich media, and it's about as well, how do we, those of us who have Blackboard as our learning management system, it's how many students really bother to try the audio mode for something, and to listen instead of looking at the stuff. The reliability of that translation is another factor, but on the whole, I've heard the same as Linda. Students say they listen to stuff while they're doing their chores. I don't know which is more shocking, the fact that they're all saying they do chores, or the fact that they're actually happy to do chores, listening to learning material as a way to catch up with it. So, and for those of us who are neurodiverse, it's like trying to find ways to reduce that fear factor around something that seems very academic and something very serious, and switching that around to something that makes your brain go, oh, I can do that. And that's a very important factor as part of inclusivity, isn't it?
And what I should say is that I'm not advocating for the use of this, but I was just experimenting.
Yeah.
I shared the same thing at the same blog post at the university once, and I got a textful, so to speak, of, oh, we shouldn't be using Google. It's like, you're using Microsoft. Stop being a hypocrite. Microsoft is embedded. It's invisible. Let's not beat up Google because Microsoft is invisible. They're both evil.
Very funny.
That's a great point. I haven't heard it expressed as clearly before, Dustin. I would like that as my ringtone.
There was something else, Victoria. I think it was Victoria that brought in about having experimented with 3 different podcast generation tools, and the fact that they seem to all use a formula with the kind of fake banter, and whether you can imagine if every single lecturer rushed to create these podcasts, students would probably be like, oh, not again. So there is a level of, like, in a sense, thank goodness not everyone's doing the same thing. Like Linda, if everybody did VR suddenly, that that unique value add gets lost as well. So we do need a variety of approaches, don't we? But yeah, what do you think about, do you feel, Dustin, that this kind of thing has enough, it is enticing enough that people are going to invest in it and create more options, like you're saying, allowing you to choose how much banter gets inserted in a podcast, or changing the accents and things like that?
Potentially, but I think people will still be worried about, what resources can they upload? Are they allowed to upload certain resources? And of course, the fear of, technology, of what they can use, what they shouldn't use, how you can't, or you allegedly shouldn't ask students to create accounts on these different tools. There's always going to be a couple of people, a Luddite who just won't do it, or the fearmongers who will just be anti whatever for no clear reason. Or even more harmful, you will get people in high places who will tell you that you cannot use X, Y, or whatever because it's spyware. And I had a colleague once told me that Audacity is spyware, like nothing is truly free. And it's like, okay, thank you for your neoliberal libertarian argument. You were obviously wrong. It is free. So please, take your thoughts elsewhere, because ultimately, if you're telling people they can't use certain free tools and you're wrong about why, you're misrepresenting the danger of these tools, or saying that there's a danger when there is no danger. Some of them are not dinosaurs, Linda. Some of them are just incompetent.
Could I ask Linda a question? Linda, I love the kind of work that you're doing, and I love the way it's all this kind of panoply of lots of different approaches. One of the things that is clear, though, is that you had a lean budget. That budget may not be replaced. Can you tell us a little bit about how you are going from project to sustainability?
So it's, to be honest, the easiest thing that I've been doing and kind of the furrow that I've been ploughing is really through the story maps, because you know we can kind of do stuff like that. We do have in-house equipment, like we do have the 360 headsets, we do have the VR headsets, we do have the 360 cameras. You know, we have a license for ARC, so you know I can create whatever I want. If I take photographs when I'm in the field, you know, I can update my resource. So it's more the filming one was the particular one that I got an internship with, and they do exist within our university, and I know they exist within other universities, and it's on my agenda to kind of do that again, because it was a really productive relationship. But it is really about being on a budget. What can you do on a budget? What are you know able to facilitate? And if you've got in-house tools, like say if it's Arc Story Map, or you know you could create something very simple in OneNote or PowerPoint, you know, if you can do it from your desktop with the equipment that you've got, that's the way to kind of maintain it. The other stuff is kind of exciting and kind of a bit out there. But I do think there's more departments been investing in sort of, you know, the sort of smaller stuff, like I mean the 360 cameras we have are just the GoPro Max. You know, they're a couple of £100. You know, the headsets were a bit more expensive, but again, they came through a sort of university sort of open call, you know, what bits of equipment do you want? So, you know, we have been fortunate in that way. But really it is trying to use something that's simple, that's free, and that you know you can update all the time. Like I say, there was an investment, there was a freeware 360 tool I used originally when pandemic first started called RoundMe, but that became a consequence of the war in Ukraine, I think, in terms of where it was provided from, and it completely disappeared. And then that's how I actually got into ThingLink. But now ThingLink is slightly more difficult to use as well. Although I've already pinged Shan to ask where the link is to the Xerte, because I'm going to play with that now. But yeah, it's trying to use sort of simple tools to get your end. And I think something we've been quite clear about is, you know, you've got it's not style over substance. It's got to work pedagogically. It can't be an always bang sort of approach. It still has to be structured, it has to be scaffolded, it has to prompt students in a way that isn't just, oh look, we've got this amazing tool, how fantastic, and then the learning disappears. You know, what are the learning outcomes? We've said this a lot to people, you know, it's got to be driven by the learning outcomes. You know, there's no point in doing things because it exists basically. But yeah, the tools that are available within your institution are the way to kind of go with this and to do something that's simple. That's how I started, simple. I didn't go highbrow. I really just went, what can I do? I had photographs from field sites, you know, from previous trips. I always take pictures. What could I make with that? And that was kind of my gateway.
Yeah, thank you.
I used to advocate for OneNote as well for similar reasons. The only time was during the pandemic when we were trying to make a shared document and they thought it was going to work, but no, OneNote at that time didn't do well as a live document.
Yeah, I have encountered that as well. It is better.
We've got lots of other experts within our delegates, people who have joined us. Hi Dee as well, I've just noticed you're here. I wonder if anyone else would like to pop in and talk about anything they've experienced. We've got quite client audience here.
Might be a good spot if nobody has anything for Ron to say a little bit about the functionality, the new functionality in Xerte, and whether or not there's kind of materials that would help people get started on that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Alistair.
Yeah, nothing like landing you in it, is a.
Yeah, I was going to grab a link for those that weren't part of the Xerte conference. I'll put a link in, which won't be very useful yet, except that you can see the program. The conference was on Thursday last week, but the recordings will hopefully be embedded in that same resource by the end of tomorrow, or certainly early next week. The thing about Xerte, you know, we're using Xerte for this project. We've been using it from the very beginning, so since 2016-17. The project funded some developments. We released a new version of Xerte last week. One of the things, going back to the whole kind of 360 type interaction, though, that I think is a good test for anybody, is that when you're creating those kinds of resources, make sure they work for a user that can only use the keyboard and can't use a mouse. And I think that's kind of a scary thing to test for as well, because a lot of the tools don't allow that. So you might see lots of hotspots that you can navigate to and click on and open, but actually you can't get to them if you're a keyboard only user. One of the things we make sure in Xerte, and you know, I wouldn't necessarily say we get it 100% right, but that is to make sure those kind of things work. The other thing about Xerte is that it's free and open source. So once you have an organizational installation, like they do at Bangor, like they do at many of the universities, I think that I see delegates from today, anyone can use it, including, as Alistair mentioned, students. So you can get that co-creation amongst colleagues and co-creation again amongst students, and it will accept any kind of media typically that you want to throw at it. So as well as text and images, there are lots of interactions you can build on those images, nothing to do with kind of 360 images, but of course there is the 360 functionality as well. So and all kind of relatively accessible and natively accessible out of the box, so you don't have to be an expert on accessibility to be able to you know, kind of take advantage of a lot of that. And it's a journey that you don't necessarily get to the end of it. You can start very low tech, but build up your resources and the complexity of them and the interactivity of them as you proceed on that learning curve. And it's not going to be taken away from you because there's an exorbitant license fee or whatever.
Thanks for that, Ron. We're all, quite a lot of the future teacher people are very passionate about Xerte, and I think Theresa's kind of fishing for an account. Joking, but
You saw straight through me, Lillian.
sorry, Teresa.
I do run an install where lots of individuals that have been exposed to Xerte at universities pay for an annual account on the install that I run. So yes, that is possible, but there isn't a free account, I'm afraid.
And I just wondered, Dee, I don't want to put you in a hot spot, but I attended the JISC accessibility in XR, which is extended reality webinar, and it was very interesting. A lot of it went over my head, but it was so good to see people really committed to accessible standards as we go into rich media. So everything about optionality, about options for changing settings. If you can't touch something, if you can't speak something, if you can't hear something, if you can't see something, all these options were built into the whole idea of extended reality standards. It was very, very, I don't know, it was very inspiring to see that it was being thought about from the ground up, which was absolutely fabulous. Thank you, Alistair. He's off to do great work with the Publisher Accessibility Group.
I know Dustin's off as well, so I just wanted to make sure everybody knows that our presenters today will be awarded badges on behalf of Future Teacher. So keep a lookout in your email account for to pick up your badge and share widely and proudly.
Absolutely. And I'm going to stop the recording here.